Now we are going to hear the second paper of this panel, and it is a panel about Shias in Lebanon. And Lebanon also is a very interesting context where we are in front of a multi-confessional country with an established Shia community, and we have also the strong presence of Hezbollah, and we have it is also a interesting country in terms of power sharing between different religions and confessions and denominations in this country. Now, Dr. Fouad Marei, I hope I'm pronouncing well his surname, is going to share his paper with us, and okay. Dr. Marei is a research associate at the University of Birmingham. His research focuses on Islamic religiosities, piety, Shia politics, Islamic eschatology, and jihadi violence. He has research experience in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and is particularly interested in conflict and post-conflict dynamics. His ongoing research examines Shia rituals, practices, and cultures in the Middle East and the diaspora. Fouad has previously worked at the University of Erfurt and the Free University of Berlin in Germany, and the Orient Institute in Beirut, Lebanon. He also consulted governments and think tanks on regional politics, and he has been involved in developing and implementing conflict stabilization and transformation programs. Fouad holds a PhD from Durham University. Thank you, Fouad, for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Mino, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And it's been a wonderful morning with the first panel and with Avi's presentation. So I'm going to try to match that if I can. Also try to keep an eye on the time. There we go. Good. So my presentation, as you mentioned, is going to be focused on Lebanon, but I also try to situate Lebanon in a broader context. I slightly changed the title to, instead of Lebanon, the case for Lebanon. So I want to kind of look at why Lebanon could be important or is important in broader, let's say, evolutions of global Shi'ism. Let me also try to share my screen with you. There we go. So I'll try to keep an eye on the time, but Mino, please keep me in check. Good. Where are we? Yeah. So Lebanon, as you may know, is a small country with a with a small population of under 7 million people. These include Lebanese and non-Lebanese residents. Even though the Shia have a very long history in Lebanon, they're an indigenous population. This is not, we're not speaking about an immigrant population of any sort. And they also do constitute somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population, making them the biggest confessional group in the country. Which of course places Lebanon next to Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain as the only countries with a Shia majority population. Nonetheless, with a Shia population of approximately 2 million, Lebanon accounts for less than 2% of the world's Shia population. More importantly, Shi'ism is not, of course, a state religion in the country. The country has a very complex political system, which I'll speak about briefly in a minute. For the sake of argument, let's call it a secular state, so to speak. It is one of 18 recognized confessional communities, so it is by no means a state religion. Moreover, Lebanon does not occupy any important role on the sacred or intellectual Shia cartography. The country is not home to any significant pilgrimage sites, for example, with the exception of a small shrine dedicated to a Sayyidah Khawla, a purported daughter of Imam Hussein in the city of Baalbek. The shrine attracts very few international pilgrims and is barely even popular amongst Lebanese Shias. And while South Lebanon, or Jabal Amel, is historically a traditional center of Shia learning, modern-day Lebanon is not by any stretch of imagination a prime destination for students of the Hawza, excuse me, which is a seminary for Shia clerical education. It is true that Beirut has become home to a mushrooming number of institutions of clerical learning since the mid-90s, but these institutions are usually branches of larger establishments abroad. the majority of Lebanese students themselves are likely to complete their clerical training and graduate from the universities from the Hawza in Iraq, Iran, or Syria, even if they commence their studies in Lebanon. So with all that said, why then take Lebanon seriously in the study of the broader Shia world, or in the study of transnational dynamics or global transformations of Shi'ism? So in this intervention, I'm going to try and argue the case for Lebanon. I'm going to argue that Lebanon has a broader relevance in processes that shape the consolidation, well, the emergence, the consolidation, and the transformation of Shi'ism at the transnational and global levels, with an impact that reaches far beyond Lebanon and the Middle East in general, or more broadly. So to do that, I'll focus on I'll mention four different aspects of the Lebanese, let's say, case that make it well situated to play a role far superseding its own size in relation to the global Shia community. So the first is the political system, or the political culture, or also the political economy. As Mino mentioned, it is a multi-confessional country governed by a constitutional democratic system, which is, of course, it's known for its labyrinthine politics of consensus, complex power sharing, precarious balances of power. But what concerns me here is another element of this democratic system, which is called segmental autonomy. It is a quality that creates a sense of communal or communitarian individuality and independence, and allows for the different communities, in this case, confessional communities, to realize and express their own life worlds, legal systems, and cultural subunits. So in this case, this has meant that the confessional communities in Lebanon, including the Shia, of course, have developed a whole range of infrastructures that are exclusive to their respective communities. Coupled with the country's foreign entanglements and also its liberal or neoliberal political economy, this resulted in the development of a Shia-specific web of diplomatic relations, political relations, and economic relations with foreign state and non-state actors, be they Iran or the prominent marja'iyat of Shia clerics in Iraq and Iran, also in the military sense with militant actors in Iraq or in Yemen, and other hand. The other thing I want to focus on is the also internal transformations of the Shia society or the Shia community in Lebanon itself. So one important aspect to bear in mind here is the very rapid socio-economic mobility and transformation of the community. The community has changed quite drastically over the last 40 or 50 years in terms of income, in terms of family sizes, in terms of education, and also in terms of urbanization. The community, which was once perceived, even stigmatized, as a community of backward and rural impostures on the cosmopolitan Mediterranean port city of Beirut, is today a community of urbanites, well-educated, middle income, the middle income bracket up within that community is much larger. And the southern suburbs of Beirut is their center of gravity. And here I have a screenshot from a 1998 movie about the Civil War, in which there's a very obvious kind of stigmatization of the feminized, vulgar Shia woman, as an imposter on the city. Intellectually, the community also has a very important intellectual legacy. Intellectually, the community is deeply indebted to the clerical authority of important junior activist sheikhs, as well as the Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, who passed away in 2010. He is, of course, one of the most influential forebearers of Shia revisionism and revivalism in the second half of the 20th century, more globally, and the spiritual father of the Shia Islamic movement in Lebanon. Fadlallah, who participated in the articulation and the development of revolutionary Shi'ism in the seminaries of Najaf and Qom in the mid to late 20th century, left behind a legacy of activist Shi'ism, Shia revivalism, and an activist political theology coupled with a wide array of institutional and charitable community organizations. With the passing of Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in 1989, a disagreement or a rift started to emerge between Fadlallah and Khomeini's successor Khamenei over the claim to marja'iyya and, of course, the theory of wilayat al-faqih altogether. In the Lebanese context, this resulted in a rift between the Grand Ayatollah and a coterie of, or a small group of junior sheikhs who constitute or surround Hezbollah, and for whom he had been a spiritual guide for much of the 1980s and early 1990s. This rift manifested itself in a subtle but significant politics of differentiation between the two groups, the Fadlallah-inspired activist sheikhs and the activist sheikhs loyal to Khamenei and close to Hezbollah. This also resulted in a discernible decoupling between the institutions affiliated with the office of the Marja and those affiliated with Hezbollah, a rift which is especially visible in faith-based primary schools, social clubs, mosques, cultural centers, and the media, and is also reflected visibly in divergent approaches to ritual cultures and public performances of piety. So in short, the community has witnessed a massive socioeconomic and also generational leap, which puts it in a very different position today than in, let's say, the mid to the third quarter of the 20th century. Another important aspect about Lebanon is the diaspora. As you might have noticed in my first slides, Lebanon is a country whose diaspora outnumbers its residents, perhaps, rivaled only by the Palestinians and the Armenians. The diaspora is estimated at somewhere between 8 and 14 million, as opposed to a population of 7 million. Lebanese immigration is also historically and geographically diverse, and Lebanese of all confessional backgrounds have immigrated to Egypt and North and South America since the mid to late 19th century, to Western Africa, Europe, and Australia since the early 20th century, and to the oil-rich monarchies of the Persian Gulf since the oil boom in the 1970s. Diasporic Lebanese communities customarily retain very strong socioeconomic ties and economic ties to their ancestral hometowns, often incentivized and nurtured by prominent families, notables, the dominant Shia political parties, state institutions, clerical networks, and philanthropic associations. The majority of Lebanese, going back to the Shia, the majority of Lebanese Shia in Europe, for example, arrived to the continent in the second half of the 20th century, especially during and after the Lebanese civil war in the 1980s. They arrived as students, immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers against the backdrop of the country's civil war, Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon, and economic inopportunity in the northeastern Bekaa Valley, all of them being the traditional homelands of the Lebanese Shia. The last point I want to mention here before going really into kind of what this means is a fourth element that puts Lebanon in a unique position in the broader Shia world, so to speak. It is a country with a very strong media infrastructure. It has a strong legacy of free media. I mean, as the Arabic proverb in the 20th century used to say, Egypt thinks, Lebanon publishes, and Iraq reads. So Lebanon kept this kind of reputation of having a strong legacy of free media and a very strong infrastructure as such. And even though Lebanese media can be highly partisan and somewhat very sectarian, it acts very often as a unified body in the face of perceived attacks on free expression. For example, the collective uproar against the banning of Hezbollah's Al-Manar TV by several Western European governments. So I want in the remainder of my presentation to locate Lebanon in relation to broader global transnational dynamics and transformations of Shi'ism. And here I want to focus on two things: the role of the Lebanese Shia in the consolidation and transformation of a Shia global or a Shia world. And I want to also particularly mention a couple of examples from the very peripheries of that Shia world, and the role of the Lebanese Shia in the consolidation and transformation of a Shia diaspora, especially in Europe. So with regards to the first point, I want to point out here that Beirut has emerged as a pan-Shia hub and cultural artistic epicenter. Lebanon has developed into that kind of an epicenter, with the city of Beirut becoming a cultural artistic epicenter for a transnational Shia mediascape. Several pan-Shia satellite channels produce and or air from Beirut, such as the children's Taha TV or the Al-Sha'ir TV, which focuses on ritual practices. Especially with the emergence of an Iraqi Shia mediascape following the fall of Saddam Hussein, Beirut emerged as a center for the training of Iraqi Shia media crews and artists, as well as Iraqi Shia media production companies. And in some cases, they have even kind of equipped Iraqi production and broadcasting infrastructures. So here, for example, you see, in this cartoon or this motion movie, it's a small motion movie produced by Bassem Karbala, and arguably one of the most important and prominent Iraqi ritual purveyors in southern Iraq and Basra. And there he portrays himself and his children as he tells them the story, kind of poetically and musically of Al-Imam al-Mahdi. So even such a, an icon of Iraqi Shia religious cultural production has oftentimes produced, filmed, and even aired from Beirut. So another aspect of this, and this is where I go back to the point about the peripheries. Beirut has also become a hub for Shia cultural production and media production in countries where that is not possible. So in the case you see in front of you here, these are screenshots from the Al Masira Network. Al Masira Network is the official TV and radio station and the mouthpiece of Ansarullah movement in Yemen, or the Houthis. It was established in 2012 and it is headquartered in Beirut. It airs from Beirut. Al Masira received support and training by Al Manar and shares Al Manar's media infrastructures. It even shared its headquarters in Beirut's southern suburbs. This has visibly shaped how Al Masira reports on Yemeni politics, on the Yemeni civil war, but also on the subtle but very discernible performative and aesthetic productions and transformation of the Houthi political rallies and Zaidi ritual practices. So there you see, for example, the Ashura speech by the leader of the Houthi movement or the Ansarullah movement, Abdel Malik Badruddin. And on the other side there you see the processions in Sana'a, also broadcast by Al Masira. And in both cases, I mean, if you go into really aesthetic analysis and so on, you really see how, you know, Abdel Malik is being produced in a very Nasrallah kind of fashion. Also, if you look at the processions in Ashura, but also in Mawlid in Yemen, you see a bit of an influence there on how these processions take place. It also kind of put Yemen on a transnational Shia mediascape or under that lens. So Al Manar TV and nowadays Iraqi and Iranian TV channels broadcast live footage from Yemen during Ashura and Al-Arba'in and other occasions as one of the many centers of Shia. Let's say, you know, you have all these small screens from Karbala, Najaf, Iran, of course, Scandinavia, Denmark, Yemen. So Yemen has been put into that kind of global imagination. Now, what's happened here? Yeah. Similarly, also, I mean, similar findings can be reported from Nigeria, where a small Shia community is becoming increasingly integrated in the global Shia Ummah, with the help of Lebanese Shia immigrant communities or diaspora communities in Western Africa, as well as in the pan-Shia mediascape. So here, for example, you see the Sheikh Hamid Shahriyari, Hujjatul Islam Hamid Shahriyari from Iran, who is also the Secretary General of the Iran-based World Forum for Proximity of Islamic Mazahib or schools, speaking at a Lebanese Husseiniya in Nigeria on the occasion or on the anniversary of the Zarya Massacre. The Zarya Massacre, which also features in the top two videos there, in a in a kind of a, how would you describe that, in a latmiya, in a ritual lamentation poem and video and music video, it's I don't want to get into the also very contentious politics of wording, but the massacre, so to speak, is an attack by the Nigerian army on a Shia Husseiniya in Zarya in northern Nigeria. And there in this music video, for example, you hear Maysam Muti'i, who's the mouthpiece of Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, especially the Arabic language mouthpiece of Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, performing a ritual lamentation poem. This was mediatized and produced with videos and footage from Nigeria in Beirut by a Lebanese production company. And as I said there at the bottom, you also see kind of the annual commemoration. Especially last year, it was all done virtually because of COVID. So there you see, you know, the kind of live intervention from Tehran. Now, on the second point, which is the kind of the Lebanese Shia and the consolidation or transformation of a European Shia diaspora, there I will try to build on what my colleagues in especially the previous panels and Avi had mentioned. So one aspect here, or one transformation to bear in mind here, is that we are currently experiencing the emergence of a first generation of Europe-born Lebanese Shias for whom also European languages are a native tongue and a language of preaching alongside Arabic. So here I feature two persons who are becoming quite prominent in the German-speaking world, Dr. Ali Talib from Cologne and I forget now his name, Sheikh Muhammad Tama from Berlin. Now, both of them are also part of a first generation of Europe-born graduates of the religious seminary of the Hausa. And they were both kind of, they both had ceremonies in the last 3 years where they were you know, they got to wear the turban and they got to assume the title of sheikh as, you know, so it's a very important moment in, let's say, European Shia demography, something that Ingvild touched upon, but also I think, you know, kind of enters into a conversation with non-London examples, as Oliver mentioned. Another aspect is the emergence of not just kind of German Lebanese Shias or so on, but also the emergence of translocal agents. And here I feature Yahya Farah from Malmö, from Sweden, who is not just based in Sweden, but he's also based part-time in Sweden, part-time in Lebanon, and makes an effort to perform ritual lamentation majalis in several languages. So he does so in German, he does so in Swedish, he does so in Arabic, he does so in English, and he travels around the European continent. So he's a translocal agent. And because of him also, there has become more pan-Shia ritual congregations emerging in Germany that bring together Iraqis, Afghans, Lebanese, and also Turkish-speaking Shia communities. A last example of this front is also the translocal ideas or campaigns. So there is a campaign, I was going to mention it, but also I think my colleague Emmanuel mentioned it from London, Who is Hussein? So the civil campaign of informing people, it started off in London, now it's been translated into German and is becoming part of a German Shia landscape. I don't want to get into the conversation about civil and religious engagement, but I think this kind of touches upon that. Do I still have a little bit of time? Yeah?
Yeah, go.
Okay, so I think just the last transformation there and last example, or the last couple of examples I want to give there, is also the emergence or the Lebanese Shia communities capitalizing on their bi-nationality, so to speak. So in this case, they have, and what that means in terms of networking, in terms of initiatives and new media, pan-Shia networks. So in this case, they have, this is a year-old now initiative called Lebanon's Echo in Deutschland, which is a gathering of 12 or 14, a gathering of 14 different Shia community centers, all of whom are primarily Lebanese Shia community centers in the German-speaking world. And there they broadcast from each other's mosques regularly in order to create kind of a German Lebanese Shia. So 3 adjectives, they're not just one hyphenated, but not just hyphenated once, but twice, mediascapes and imaginations. Now, in conjunction with that, there was also a broader initiative centered in Beirut, or started in Beirut, called the Hearts Union, or Ittihad al-Qulub, which centers around Mujamma Sayyid al-Shuhada, which is the big community center and the heart of Hezbollah's ritual performances in Beirut's southern suburbs. And this initiative centers in Beirut, started on the eve of Sha'ban 15th, so the birth of Imam Mahdi, patronized by Sheikh Akram Barakat, who's one of Hezbollah's, one of the most important and popular preachers affiliated with Hezbollah. And so there you see kind of, it places Beirut in a much broader context, which includes Iranian. There I will just, it's you know, over 6,000 institutions participate in this. Yeah. I'm finished now.
Yeah, okay.
And so there you see, you know, they kind of broadcast several different transnational, pan-national ritual performances. Here you see a Lebanese performer who was performing that day an Iraqi-type majlis from Jamkaran in Qom, and it was broadcasting more internationally. So these challenges, just to leave it there, of course, it all sounds, you know, rosy and big and massive. Of course, they're not without serious consequences. So, you know, bringing in all of these transnational ideas, it also cuts across what is legal, what is not legal, and what is legal where and what is not legal where. So, you know, solidarities with a certain person like Qasim Soleimani, the IRGC commander slain in Iran, you know, commemorating him in European Husseiniyyat that are Lebanese, had them shut, had them raided, and had Hezbollah within 3 months classified as a terrorist organization in its entirety. So yes, this kind of mediascape is crossing boundaries, but it's also clashing at these kind of junctures. I hope I haven't taken too long. Thank you, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you,
Fouad. Thank you. It was very, very interesting, and I have many questions for both of you, but I prefer, I don't know if we have any question from the public here. So
there's one in the chat I can comment on.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat, Avi. I think it is for you. If you can answer that question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And it's the community is, yes, mostly from Punjab, Twelver, Shia, and I guess if there was one marja who most would say they follow, it would be Ali Sistani. So that obviously has an impact on how, on the performance of lamentation rituals. If they followed another Ayatollah who was more unambiguously critical of the practice, then it wouldn't be such an important part of the ritual. I see Emmanuel's hand up. Yes. Minu, if you had questions, I don't know.
Emmanuel has a question, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, yes. First of all, thank you for both of the presentations. Very interesting. I had a question for Avi. I was really interested that you had these two figures of these two sort of community pillars in Amir and Hassan. And you mentioned that Amir, who had the kind of more proactive, slightly reactionary, perhaps slightly politicized sort of approach to civic action and kind of integration of the Shia community, was actually a convert and of Catalan origin. And I wondered whether you thought that this was significant in terms of the way in which he chose to engage the community, and whether it spoke to the status of minorities and immigrants more broadly in Spain, in that only someone who comes from a Spanish background or Catalan background would be able to have that kind of muscular approach, or whether that's completely not part of it at all and it was more it was sort of incidental.
Yeah, I think this is a person who's a lawyer. He's used to negotiate, kind of fighting for people's rights. He works with immigrants, helping them get legal documents. He has a history of militancy and, in terms of his involvement in politics or political movements and labor syndicates. And he has a general comfort, having been born here in Spain and grown up in Catalonia and speaks the languages, and he has nobody's going to accuse him of not integrating and not being willing to adapt. He's from here, so he feels more empowered in a lot of ways to adopt this very assertive, muscular approach to dealing with public authorities, whereas first generation immigrants who are very sensitive to being stereotyped and stigmatized and face a lot of racial and ethnic prejudice in addition to religious prejudice, they and also have less comfort in general with the culture, language, don't feel so free and empowered to adopt so it's absolutely not incidental. It reflects a certain positionality of these different representatives within the local context.
Thank you. I think that we do not have other questions, so I'm gonna ask. Okay, Prof. I can't.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I loved both the last presentations. Very, very interesting, both of them. But I have a question for Avi. I've also been following the processions that has taken place in Oslo, and I can really recognize some of the changes that you are talking about. But and you mentioned that the Oslo participants, they make certain adjustments to, for example, they distinguish between being inside the ritual hall and being out in the street. But so as you have followed these processions, how would you say the audiences are responding, the people in the street, when they observe this rather, I suppose, very unfamiliar procession taking place, is it something that they can recognize as something that connects with Catholic traditions, or is it very different and very strange?
So initially, when one of the first processions was organized, this former politician, a kind of a big name in the local scene, wrote a scathing editorial about how we're taking us back to the Middle Ages, and it was fundamentalist and terrorist, and it was being allowed in plain sight. And and you certainly have this kind of reaction, when you just look at, I didn't systematically interview audience members. You can get a sense sometimes, people are out there with their phones, standing on their balconies, recording everything. For them, it's sort of like an exotic thing and it's a very powerful kind of expression. Some people even kind of, lightly do it themselves, or just to kind of like, mimic, not in a mocking way, but just to kind of, some people are just fascinated. I think it's for them a sort of novelty, although, it's been happening for 15 years now. So probably a lot of people in the neighborhood are used to it and kind of, just, okay, that's just what they do this time, a couple times a year. And of course, there are individuals who you see sporadically shaking their heads and clearly upset about the display. And so I imagine you really get a variety, although I think it would be interesting to somehow figure out a way to collect data systematically on audience reactions, which is a difficult thing. Sorry, Minu, did you want to ask your questions?
So I was trying to unmute one of the participants who is a Lebanese, one of my Lebanese friends here, and he had a question, but I don't know why I can't unmute him. By the way, I'm gonna ask you, and then Mohammed, who is my Lebanese friend here, will ask his question. I have two questions for both of you. My first question regards the paper of Avi, and I wanted to know whether you have any activities of Who is Hussein campaign in Spain. And the other question regards the paper of Fouad. And I wanted to know, after the demise of your great Ayatollah, the great Marja of Lebanon, Fazlullah, I was wondering whether the legacy of Ayatollah Fazlullah has been somehow continued in your country through his family, perhaps his son. I know that they are doing something. Perhaps he has a foundation, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in Beirut, perhaps. And if you can explain something about their activity now in Lebanon. Thank you.
I'll just say very briefly, thanks for the question. I haven't seen any, and I think it's reflective of the fact that Who's Hussein is likely to be more appealing for second generation, third generation than kind of first generation. But I don't know. I haven't studied Shia Islam everywhere in Spain, but I haven't seen any local advocates or of Who's Hussein here.
Thank you, Mino, for that question. I mean, the marjaya of Ayatollah Fadlallah, of course, persists. The office of the marjaya still exists. His son has taken over, the Friday prayer in the Al Hassanain Mosque. The mosque is still very symbolic in southern Beirut. And of course, and you're right, there's a very important foundation, Al-Mabarrat, still runs a huge number of schools, caters for orphanages, also provides female education, adult education, etc. That said, though, there are two aspects that kind of are incomparable pre-2010 and post-2010, which is the date that he passed. The charisma of Ayatollah Fadlallah is, of course, not there anymore. His son, by all stretches of imagination, cannot fill his shoes. There is a large number of junior sheikhs, not just his son, who are, provoking a lot of Fadlallah-inspired opinions amongst the Lebanese Shia. But without the charisma of Fadlallah, without the authority of Fadlallah, I think those were the two most important resources that made him and Hezbollah equals on the Lebanese scene for most of the 90s, or 80s and 90s, let's say. Since then, you would clearly see, and that you can mark, that's marked in a generational sense. Those who kind of are socialized in the 80s and 90s, of course, continue to follow the marja'iyah of Fadlallah. They don't need to change it. But on the one hand, his absence means that a lot of younger people lack that kind of charisma, lack that kind of image, and therefore it's a very different dynamic. And the second thing is, of course, you cannot follow a dead marja, and therefore anyone who's coming of age today as the Shi'i does not follow his marja'iyah, instead follows the marja'iyah of, that you get taught in a Hezbollah school, in a Hezbollah-run school, which is the dominant narrative. And that's why the marja'iyah of Khamenei, I think, in the last 10 years is quadrupled.
Sorry, I lost your last sentence. You said Ayatollah Khamenei.
I said I don't have numbers, but I would say that probably the marja'iyah of Ayatollah Khamenei has probably quadrupled in the last 10 years.
Okay, I got it.
Especially amongst, as I said, those coming of age.
So, okay. So you do not have any charismatic Ayatollah now in Lebanon?
No, there's a lot of young junior sheikhs, but they all compete at equal level. There's no Fadlallah versus the rest.
Okay, thank you. So Mohammed, please ask your question.
Yes, hi, I joined late, so I don't know what I missed before, and I'm very much interested in politics, so I'm more, like, my perspective and question is more directed in that direction. I wanted to ask both about the Karbala narrative, how it is, if they have seen something interesting during their research. What I mean, to be precise, is I for example saw in Lebanon how the Karbala narrative was somehow used to mobilize the Lebanese Shiites during the Israeli occupation, and then afterwards lately during the Syrian civil war. So how this narrative changed, it's also a point that is interesting for me to know how in a European context, where can this mobilization lead to in case? And part of what Avi said about the Amir and Hassan, it seems to me a bit clear that one, the Amir figure personifies or somehow imitates the figure of Hussein, which is the more, proactive, and then the quietest Hassan approach to things, which is, nay, let's make peace, let's be. So my question is, again, if there's any interesting findings in your research regarding the Karbala narrative in the European context. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really, shall I go first, Fouad? It's a really interesting question, Mohammed. I thought it was, I found it very interesting to look at how sometimes various civic forms of performativity were justified or advocated using kind of religious narratives, narratives like the narrative of Karbala. For instance, one of the newer leaders of the community would say, like, look, this isn't a time to stay at home and be yourselves. This is a time to be open and reach out to the local community and answer questions and explain things and help the people who are suffering around us. And it was a very kind of religiously inspired discourse, but advocating kind of civic-minded activities. So that was like one instance where I saw this, I think, these performativities that kind of drew very neat distinctions between them, but civic and religious performativities in practice are often very much entangled and entwined.
I'll just jump in on that. And I'll say there, when you speak about the Karbala narrative, I think I would like to, I mean, I prefer to use the word activist Shi'ism or Shia revisionism. And there, I think there are two things that are indispensable. The rest is all contextual and, you know, depends on interpretation. The two elements there are kind of understanding hagiography, the history of the, you know, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein as, well, Imam Hussein revolted against injustice, and that's why he was killed. It's not just a tragedy to cry over. And in terms of eschatology, we don't just wait for the Messiah, we work towards the Messiah. Those are the two kind of important aspects. Now, how they've been interpreted is a very different story, and that's where I would like to just make a very short comment there. As you mentioned, in the Lebanese case, it kind of provided the ideological and even theological foundation for the emergence of Hezbollah, the Islamic resistance against Israel, and so on. In other contexts, and this is where the Lebanese community in Lebanon, in Europe is an interesting case, because they could not take that unchanged to the European context. And in this case, particularly, for example, Germany, which has a very, you know, particular relationship with anti-Semitism. You could not take it unchanged about, you know, Israel and so on. It has to change, and it gets then contextualized. So as other presenters, for example, mentioned, it could take a very civil, civic form, etc. So it does mobilize, but the principle of activism and acting, you know, or foregrounding action rather than just waiting and lamenting is quite central in let's say the form of Shi'ism that my interlocutors adhere to.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Now I should, we have run out of time. So I'm gonna thank all of you for your participation, your patience, and your collaboration in this second panel. And we are going to have a lunch pause now, and we will going to back here at 2:13 Italian time. So have a nice lunch and see you a bit later. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you.